So Jim Walsh and I are sitting back here on our back patio. Jim is a professor. He's the facilitator of the Romero Troupe. Um, he's a lot. He's somebody I really admire and have learned a lot from. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Jim?
I'm Jim Walsh. I'm a father, a son, a brother, a colleague, an activist, a professor, a gardener, a cyclist. What did I miss?
You're a goofball. No, you're really my brother, man. That's for sure. Um, so, Jim, you grew up in Pennsylvania, right? Why don't you tell us about your roots a little bit?
Yeah, I grew up in. I was born in a steel town near Pittsburgh, a place called Butler. Um, my grandfather worked 40 years in the steel mill. His lungs gave out when he turned 70. Um, my uncles work in the mill. I have some cousins that work in the mill. Um, but we moved away to a place closer to Pittsburgh called Cranberry, and that's really where I grew up. And it was a rural place at that time, about 45 minutes from Pittsburgh. And my parents bought the only home they ever owned when I was in the fourth grade. I was 10, and that's where they died too. It was a little tract home, about 1,000 square feet, one story, and they raised 7 kids in that house. Irish Catholic. Um, we were shanty Irish.
Um, so, and you got out of Pittsburgh or Pennsylvania by wrestling, right?
Yeah, I was pretty sheltered. We never really left the uh, Pennsylvania. I had been to Ohio and West Virginia, and that was the extent of it. Making it to the shores of Lake Erie, we thought was a big deal. It's about an hour and a half north of where I grew up. But my brothers joined the wrestling team when they were in middle school, and I did everything they did. So I went ahead and joined the local team. I was in the fifth grade or sixth grade, and I loved the sport immediately. I won my first 2 matches. Um, I just took to it. It was just something that fit my skill set. So for the first time in my life, I had something to feel confident about. I didn't have anything before this to be confident about. Um, but wrestling gave me that. It gave me this way to put my commitment into something and see the payoff. So you know, wrestling is somewhat like activism. Um, Commitment, dedication. You have to understand the long game. You're in many ways. It's a mental game as well as a physical. You're kind of in it, out there on the mat on your own. Um, so it taught me so much, and I was really successful in high school. I had a great high school career, got a scholarship to Duke University, and flew off to Durham, North Carolina when I was 18. Um, and suddenly I was around these kids from private high schools, and um, no one I went to Duke with ever had to worry about where the rent was coming from.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So that was different. That was a big shift for me. I was used to being around people who didn't have a lot, and suddenly it was just a complete. It was. I compare it to going to Pluto or something. I was way out of my element, and I just kind of sat in the back, kept my mouth shut in classes until I was encouraged to begin to talk by a professor, and that gave me some confidence to begin to share my ideas for the first time.
So, Jim, backtracking a little bit, I had the honor of meeting your mother and father. I know family is really important to you.
Yeah,
Can you talk about your mom and dad?
yeah. I lost them both several years ago to cancer. Um, uh, yeah, I was raised by two really humble people. My mom was a saint, just the most loving, caring person I've ever met. Um, I just clung to her as a boy and just followed her everywhere, and I'm like her now because of that. My siblings and I all we really do consider her a saint. She just had that. You never went into mom's house, our house, and left without eating something. So you're going to. So there were. I mean, there were always friends and traffic and people, and everyone stepped foot in that house. Get a little saucer with a piece of pie on it. In conversation, you had to update mom on what was going on with you before you left. She wanted to know. Dad was from he called himself a city slicker, but he grew up in Butler, which was about 15,000 people. That was the city, and he was from a pretty dysfunctional Irish family with a lot of mental illness, and the family wasn't close at all. We never really got to spend time with anybody on that side of the family. So Dad carried a lot of anxiety. He often disassociated with interactions. He was go isolate himself. And when we just gave him the space he needed, he worked himself to the bone. He was a furniture broker, so he drove all over Western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Eastern Ohio, and worked with all the mom and pop furniture stores in these little towns, Appalachian towns. So he would go to the mom and pop furniture stores, and they would purchase their stuff from the manufacturer he worked for. And when they bought his stuff, he got a commission. So his income was 100% commission. So he had 9 mouths to feed, and he didn't know from week to week what his income was. And he would come home some nights just good mood. He would come home other nights. You could see it immediately on his face. You didn't even say hi. You just let him go back to his room. But anyway, my mother was the perfect choice for Dad. I don't think a lot of people could have sort of navigated his emotional needs, but man, did Mom figure it out. And she kind of nursed him back to life. And he wasn't the best father because he was not always available, but he was the greatest grandfather. He had evolved into the best version of himself by the time he was in his 50s and 60s. And he was really available then. I had the best talks with my dad my whole life, in the decade or two before he died, and we became pretty close. So anyway, Dad always said he worked with these poor people all over West Virginia. He would never call on the corporate stores. He only worked with the mom and pop stores, and he called them whenever he would have an interaction with someone who was working class and struggling. He would always come back to the car and say, "Salt of the earth, Jimmy, salt of the earth." So anyway, so from Mom and Dad, I learned to love humble people, and that has never left me. I've always been much more comfortable among people who have who are intimate with struggle. And I've never been comfortable with people who seem impenetrable. They seem walled off and sanitized. And so that's comes through in all the work I've done. That's who I am, you know. So
Yeah, they were good people, Jim. Very good people. So, people, when I'm around you, people call you Professor Walsh and Dr. Walsh, and I'm like looking around like, who are they talking about? But they're talking about you, Jim. What do you get to? Can you tell us about that journey?
yeah, it was a strange journey. It started with poetry. I left Duke with a love for poetry because I took a poetry class, and there is zero connection to the humanities in my either family lineage. They're all just, you know, laborers and workers. You know, no one had the luxury of reading books. There wasn't a book in my house except my dad used to sell encyclopedias door to door, and there were a set of encyclopedias in our house, and that was it. There weren't any books, um, and so at Duke I took a poetry class and loved it. I loved it, but I learned that I didn't understand a lot of the poetry because I didn't know the historical references. So when I left Duke, I moved to Boulder to study poetry in Naropa, and that was about when I started reading history because I needed to know more history. I had never been taught any real history, and every time I picked up a book, it inspired me to want to read 10 more, and I just this hunger for knowledge and this hunger for history just overtook me. And someone said one day, Jim, all you do is read history. Why don't you just go to graduate school? So I went over to CU Denver, walked over to their history department, just started knocking on professors' doors, said, "Hey, I want to go to graduate school. What do I do?" And said, "Well, register for classes in the fall." So I got uh, into their program and met a mentor, a professor there named Mark Foster, who became a dear mentor to me. Became like, I called him my Colorado father because he took an interest in me, and I would watch him in front of the class, and I said to myself, I want to be that, I want to be that. That's what I want to do. So after I finished my master's, I said, well, to be a professor, I need a PhD. So I applied to several programs. I almost committed to the University of New Mexico. University of Rochester showed some interest, but then I realized I didn't want to leave Colorado. So the only program here is Boulder. So I had gotten into Boulder, so I called them at the last minute because I had already told them I was going to New Mexico. Called them at the last minute and I said, "Will you still have me?" And they said yes. So I started Boulder. The same thing. I had some great professors there. Julie Green was one that really stands out, and my advisor was Ralph Mann. And Ralph was the perfect advisor for me because he was from rural West Virginia. He was a humble guy. He was really soft-spoken. He wasn't arrogant at all, and it took me 12 years from the time I started my PhD until the time I graduated. And that was because the dissertation was so hard. And Ralph hung in there with me, even when most advisors would have kicked me to the curb. But even when I went to Ralph and almost asked him to just let me just cut me loose, he still refused. He said, "You're gonna get me that chapter next week." So I said, I had this epiphany one day. Jim, if you don't finish, you're gonna regret that the rest of your life, and you're probably not gonna get a position. You have an opportunity here to do this, and that opportunity is closing fast. So I put all my books in my car. I drove to Leadville, That's what my dissertation was about, was the Leadville Irish. I moved into the cheapest hotel, $40 a night, this dump on Main Street. I moved into. And I spent 2 weeks. I'd wake up in the morning, go for a run, get breakfast, and then start writing. And I'd write until sundown. And I got into the I broke out, and next week I showed up at Ralph's office. Boom. 250 pages on his desk. So anyway, I credit Ralph Mann and Julie Green for and Mark Foster for being the perfect people for me in that time of my life. And as soon as I got in the classroom, I realized it was the greatest thing. I just couldn't believe that it was possible to make a living by just talking about ideas, you know? I still can't believe they're paying me for this, huh?
Yeah, how long you been teaching now, Jim?
Well, they just gave me a medal. Because it's my 25th year at CU Denver. So, you know, I don't know what to do with a medal. I have wrestling medals, but never thought I'd get a medal for teaching. But I'm far from done. I want to do 40 years. My grandfather can do 40 years in a steel mill. I can do 40 years in a classroom. So that means I have 15 more. And I'm going to make good use of those 15 years.
Yeah, I've met several of your students, Jim. You changed lives. Tell us about your philosophy of teaching, Jim.
Well, it's all about Paulo Freire, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is a book I encountered 20 years ago, and I realized I was already using a lot of the ideas. Freire simply says that he taught illiterate migrant workers in Brazil, and for years, and after that experience, he realized that they had taught him far more than he had taught them. So he wrote about it. He wrote that the traditional method of teaching and learning, where students are forced to memorize data, and then they're given a test. Everything's in the short-term memory, and they have to regurgitate it. He says that that's a form of oppression, because it forces students to adopt a world not their own, and it teaches them that their world is insignificant. So Freire taught that the only true teaching and learning is when we're in dialogue, where students are invited to bring their worlds forth in, you know, as a collective and partnership, and all the students bring their worlds forth to help each other. So that's the way I've always taught, is figuring out creative ways for students to reveal their gifts when testing and standard research papers and standard textbooks do not get there. So yeah, just like I was the quiet kid in the back of the class that never raised my hand, those are the students I look for. They're the ones that are scared and quiet, and I know there's a world there that I need to open up, and so I just struggle to find different ways. Theater's one of them. Other art, reflection writings, journaling. There's lots of ways to do that, you know, and letting them know that what they've experienced in their lives is vital, and that should be the foundation for their entire education, is building on what they've experienced and seeing value in what they've experienced. So 15 more years.
So, Jim, I mentioned that you're the facilitator of the Romero Troupe. What the heck is the Romero Troupe?
We're still trying to figure that out, aren't we? The Romero Troupe is a kind of a collective that's never existed before in the way that we've built it. And what that is it's a theater collective, um, is that we kind of throw out the window all the norms and traditions of professional theater, where people are trained to think of theater in a certain way, that it's polished and it's smooth and um, it's kind of um, it's difficult to connect to, because you're watching very skilled actors on stage um, perform something that they've rehearsed probably 100 times, and it's unrelatable, you know. So what we do in the Romero Troupe is we put stories on stage that our audience can relate to so closely that their heart's right there in their mouth, you know, and during the play. It's impossible not to relate. It's impossible not to feel something, because we're clearly just a bunch of people who care, and we've come together to tell these stories, and that has an impact just by itself on the audience. So all volunteer, just people coming together as a collective. Um, we build the stories as a collective. Um, we try to we use a consensus model for decisions, and it works. I mean, this is our 19th year, and I estimated a few years ago that over 600 people have come through the Romero Troupe. It's probably closer to 700 now. Um, and they've all given something, to the collective fire that we've built. Everyone's thrown a little kindling in that fire. Maybe whether they've been around a few weeks or a couple decades, everyone's contributed some passion, some humanity, some hope to that fire. Well, that fire, it needs tending, and I'm not getting any younger. So I think the Romero Troupe is poised, um, to for younger generation to make it their own. And too, the older I get, the more I realize that the way I see the world um, is sort of calcified in my generation and my experiences. It can't replicate the way young people see the world, and so I want to see the troupe move into the 21st century in a healthy way, with vibrant young people leading it. That's the challenge I think we face. Many of the uh, most stalwart members of the troupe are getting up there in years, and we need to think about the voices of our youth and how they're gonna take this as their own, and so. But it's been, I started it because I used theater in my classrooms for years, and it works so well in my classrooms that one day I thought, well, um, I'm gonna just reach out to some of these students and see if they want to form a little troupe. This was in 2005, and we were invited to tell the story of Oscar Romero. It was the 25th anniversary of his death at a little church near Regis, and we were scared to death. And that night, the MC asked us what we call ourselves before he introduced us, and I said, I don't know, the Romero Troupe. That's after Oscar Romero, but we loved his story because his story is not just a story of someone speaking up for the poor. There's 1,000 stories like that. His story is about someone who initially was very entrenched in the power structures. He was compromised by the power structures of El Salvador. He was brought into his position because of that, but he couldn't stay that. He couldn't stay on that side of the fence. When push came to shove, he showed his true colors and moved over to the side of the poor. And we feel like that's what the troupe is. it's a space where people can become the best version of themselves. And we've seen that. I mean, person after person after person, they move into the space, they feel it out, and many of them develop a deep trust for that space, and then we can start to see this growth, and we bear witness to that vital process of growth, and we're all going through it too.
Yeah, I've met so many beautiful people through the Romero Troupe, and I'll remember them all. Um, it's been amazing. But what our motto is in the Romero Troupe, organic theater through social justice, or something like that. What does all that mean? What is organic theater?
Social justice through organic theater.
Yeah, you got it right. I'm sorry.
That's all right. No, it's all right. Um, well, social justice at the time we used that for a motto was a new term. Today it's become almost overused. It means like corporations use it now, so we know it's been co-opted. But organic theater, that's a beautiful term. And organic theater just means that every single person in the process, in the room, those who are on the rehearsal stage, those who are sitting and watching, every single person in the room has license to change something or to suggest something. And they know they have license. That's welcome. And it's similar to Theater of the Oppressed. Augusto Boal, his forum theater, which is a form of theater where people in the audience can stop the play and replace one of the actors and then restart it and show a different way of doing it. And the audience then can through their applause, can choose which version they like the most. So that kind of forum theater is what we use in our rehearsals, where we are it's a very messy process, but it's consensus. Whoever comes up with the best idea, the people in the room will rally behind that idea, and that idea will win the day. And so it's messy. It's we practice something and then we talk about it, and there might be 5 or 6 ideas flying around, and then we practice it again and it looks very different, and slowly but surely it migrates to a higher place and a place we're comfortable with. And that's so organic theater is a kind of it's theatrical anarchy is what it is. Anarchy meaning there's no overarching authority that's telling people what to do, and
no director, no producer.
No director, no producer, and yeah, I mean it's a beautiful process that almost always works. We trust it. We really trust that process. When we're working on something, you can just feel that energy. Everyone knows it. Don't worry, we're gonna get there. But I don't know that anyone's ever done theater like this. I know a lot of radical theater and a lot of community theaters that do radical work, but I don't think anyone's ever adopted this process. I really now believe after 19 years that we invented this. This is unique. I mean, it has not happened. Theater has never looked like this. So so the Romero Troupe is a vital community institution that has to continue. And we just had a great little couple of performances this spring. One was in the streets, and one was for DU. And what's funny is that people always show up and jump into the plays. Like this former member of America, she happened to be at this event, and she hasn't been involved for at least a decade. But there she was. She was on stage, you know, and that's the culture: is once a Romero, always a Romero. So,
So we could go on about the Romero Troupe forever, Jim.
mm-hmm.
But you mentioned the Leadville Irish and doing some work in Leadville. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so again, my love for my father and mother teaching me to love humble people. Um, when I was doing my dissertation research in Leadville about the history of Irish immigrants up there, I met a very close friend who's still a very close friend, Kathleen Fitzsimmons. And one day she said, "I want to show you something." And Kathleen took me to Evergreen Cemetery. And I thought, oh, I'm not really in the mood to look at headstones, you know. So I went along just to, you know, go along, but I wasn't really in the mood to looking at headstones. And Kathleen took me to the back of the cemetery. She said, keep walking, keep walking. We went all the way to the back of the cemetery until we were in the pauper section. And I didn't know where I was at first. I was just standing in this forest. You know, I didn't know where I was, and then it just, I can still remember it really clearly. I looked down at the ground, and there were holes, sunken holes, on the ground all around me. And then I looked more closely, and I realized that they were graves. They were sunken graves, and that as far as I could see in every direction, these sunken graves. And it was then that I realized that the people I had been researching for all those years, just a few, at that time it was just a few years, the people I had been researching, I was standing on their graves, and there they were in this forest, and I looked at those graves, and this is so clear in my memory. I made a commitment in my mind on that day that the people in those holes, I was going to adopt them and make sure they were known, you know. And so 20 years later, a big memorial's being built with the names of the people on glass. And the Irish government is funding much of this because the majority of the people there are Irish. But the non-Irish names are going up too. I mean, this to me it's called the Leadville Irish Miners Memorial. But I don't like that title because, first of all, the number of miners in that whose names are on the memorial is a fraction of the people. By calling it the Miners Memorial, we're excluding women and children. And so, and even the Leadville Irish Memorial, because about a third of the people weren't Irish. And I consider it a working class, a memorial to the working class. People who died young. The average age of the people buried there is 22. Half of them are children. They died in epidemics and mining accidents. They died from violence. They died from freezing to death, diseases. It's a horror show, and you can't go and see those sunken graves without absorbing the toll of industrial labor. And at the time that I was introduced to that cemetery, I was learning about my own Irish roots, and I discovered that I lost 3 of my great-great-grandparents who were all famine immigrants. 3 of them ended up being killed by trains. 2 of them were crushed between 2 cars. One fell off a train, and another was a brakeman, and he was thrown off the train and injured his foot, but he survived. So those were just the train accidents, the railroad accidents. That's not counting factories and mines that chewed up and spit out all these immigrant workers. And so anyway, that's been a big labor of love. But the importance, there's two huge important pieces of that to me. This isn't just about honoring 19th century Irish immigrants. It's about using the story of 19th century Irish immigrants to highlight the stories of 21st century immigrant workers. So, so that's a part of the process that we're following, is to use it as a tool to educate and to demonstrate that 40% of Leadville today are immigrants, and they do all the service work for the ski resorts, and they live in trailer parks on the edges of Leadville. And it's really the same story in many ways. It's a story that's repeating itself. We're also had the southern. I reached out to the Southern Ute Nation 2 years ago because, to me, an Irish memorial that honors people who were occupied, colonized, and exiled needs to also honor people who were occupied, colonized, and exiled locally. So that meant recognizing that this is Ute land. So that the cultural director of the Southern Ute Nation gave the most beautiful blessing at the dedication ceremony and blessed the ground with spring water and tobacco leaves. And there wasn't a dry eye in the house, because people in that moment recognized that to be Irish isn't to climb the social ladder. It's to be Irish in this country means to recognize those connections. So that's really what the work means to me in a larger context, and for it to be a pilgrimage space where anyone in the world can go to a space where the poorest of the poor are held up to the light and recognized. That means so much to me. But it has been a struggle because because the local group I've been working with, that's done a lot of the management of the memorial, hasn't shared those values. And I have pushed and scratched and clawed to ensure that the memorial reflects what it should reflect and isn't something that becomes sort of corporatized. So that's a struggle, I think, that's going to continue, to ensure that the culture of this memorial is true to what it was always meant to be, which is to honor people at the very bottom of the economic ladder who are subjected to so much, and to use those stories to educate people about today. I want this to be places where people make pilgrimages, that they come away challenging the meritocracy myth, in our society, the bootstrap model, where social class is revealed. That's what I really want this to be, a space where social class is revealed, and poor people are no longer blamed for their poverty. That's the world we live in. In Denver, during the mayoral campaign, I had to listen to people over and over and over again, how these unhoused people are ruining the city. And instead of looking into economic systems that throw people on the streets, everyone just wants to place blame at the bottom of the ladder. So that to me made the memorial even more important as a space for that.
You should be real proud of that work, Jim. It's pretty amazing what you've done.
Yeah, I am. I'm really proud of it, and yeah, I think it's been something I was meant to do. We have to break free of the world that's been scripted for us to find the life that's we're meant to live. And I was lucky to get out here to Colorado to kind of start new, to get out of that social milieu that I was raised in. And I often wonder if I had stayed, what would I be doing? And it was nothing like what I'm doing right now, I'm sure. I would be surviving, not living, if I had stayed in Pennsylvania. But to come here and to sort of remake my life in the image of the gifts I've been given has been the most rewarding thing for me.
So, I've spent a lot of time with Casper, um, who's your child.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's important, like you were talking about before, teachers are often end up learning more than they teach, right? So, what has your daughter taught you?
Casper is by far my greatest teacher. We're a team, you know. And Casper knows that 12 years old now, knows that Dad's always going to be there. Um, I think Casper's been dragged to more rallies and demonstrations than any kid in the history of Colorado. This is a kid who corrects their social studies teachers in school when they talk about social issues. Because that's all they've ever talked about their whole lives in the adults that they know. But what I've learned mostly from Casper is that struggling to be who we're meant to be is a hard path, and that this is the road Casper walks, to be the person Casper was meant to be. And so all I can do as a father is just make sure I'm walking behind them. Wherever they're walking, I'm right behind them. You know, and I think that's the greatest thing a parent can do is you walk where you're meant to walk. I'm gonna follow.
Wow, Jim. Yeah, yeah. So, finally, like, this is a hard world, and I know you have been through some really hard times personally, especially lately. But you're still a really strong person, Jim. Where do you get that strength? What keeps you going?
Wow. Um, well, I think you know at at times when I find myself drifting into darker spaces, my mother pulls me back. She always um, she always emphasized the importance of seeing the best in other people. So whenever I start drifting to the other side, Mom's voice is always there, you know, and and I think it's, for Mom, I don't know what it is she had, but she would say that every day is a great day, you know, and like when I was staying here, those were some of the hardest days of my life, but you know, I never lost that desire to get up and go have an impact on the world, and go do what I need to do that day. So I think that's all we can do. We can't control what we can't control what other people are going to do. So why spend any energy worrying about that? All we can do is control what we can do. And so that's how I like to see things, is block out the noise what can I do today to be who I am and to make the impact that I want to make, and that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to make my little mark, you know, and not worry about everyone else is doing. And that's a good philosophy, and it's something that I learned from my mom, and um, it's been the greatest gift for me. Everyone always tells me that I just have this unyielding positive way of seeing, but you know, I there are moments where I drift into negativity, and I just have to check myself and just step away from that, you know, whenever I feel it. Is it's human, I think, um, but it's also a spiral, is to go in that direction. So I've been studying the Stoics, the ancient Stoics, Stoicism, and they taught, you know, you can't, whatever you can't control, don't give your energy to it, you know. And also they taught, appreciate what you have, you know. Don't seek something you don't have, or feel envy for it, because um, it's just going to drive you crazy. Find gratitude for what you've been blessed with, you know. And that's definitely something Mom taught me. She would say, um, always count your blessings, Jimmy. Always count your blessings. So I do, and I'm a strong person. I'm independent, and I've lived the way that I have felt driven to live, and called to live, and I love the community I have, and I feel very lucky. I'm so lucky.
One more question, Jim, and this might be a hard one. Is there any regrets?
You know, I'm gonna say no, because I mean, there's decisions I've made that, in retrospect, weren't the best decisions, but um, but those struggles have also brought me great depth and wisdom. So sure, maybe if I had done Y instead of X, I would have had a smoother path through life. But I'm also deeper because of that, and I would never trade that in. I think our trials are the foundation of our strength, you know. So no, I'll make a lot more mistakes. What was it that William Butler Yeats said? Um, 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 Fail again, fail well, fail often.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jim. I appreciate you spending this time with me, and I love you, brother.
Love you too, Arnie, and this is an honor to be part of the archive you're building, because you're the perfect person to build it.
I'm not the perfect guinea pig, but thank you, Jim.
Yeah. Well, Arnie, now you know why I wanted to do this again, because I wanted to get it right, and I feel like this